Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me in the back? Wonderful. What a wonderful day for a relaxing lecture. And the view is wonderful too. I hope you have reasons to look at the screen though. So I will say a word about these lectures in a moment. It's part of nearly created tradition in the department, very meaningful, I would say. Let me first introduce myself. My name is Adilson Motter. I am a professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy here. And it was some 15 minutes ago that the chair of the department, Under Gouveia, said that I could introduce the speaker. And I was very excited about that, except I had not prepared an introduction. So I did what anyone would do. I went online and I asked ChatGPT to create a joke about the topic of the lecture. And it actually output an interesting joke. I hope we will be able to find it funny by the end of this lecture series. So I will try to use a system here to, this is the prompt I entered. I hope you'll be able to hear.
Please complete the joke. Quote.
I will put in the right language, I'm sorry.
Please complete the joke. Quotes. An American, a Chinese, and an alien are discussing what is known about graph theory by their people. The American says.
All right. That was the prompt. I thought I should enter by hand some of the prejudices, but it turns out it was not needed. So the joke then goes. The American says, well, in graph theory, we love our stars and stripes, but we are still trying to figure out whether the star graph is the best way to connect 50 vertices. Then the alien chimes in. On my planet, we've mastered intergalactic networks, but our biggest challenge is convincing Earthlings that the shortest path isn't always a straight line. No one is going to ask me anything?
What about the Chinese?
The Chinese just listened. Very interesting for plagiarism software. So the reason I was interested in introducing Arthur is because he's part of a new initiative that we have here on complex systems, and networks are really the tools that we use to study complex systems. And part of this started about a year ago when I approached the dean of the college to persuade him that in our department, in addition to have focuses on things that are very small and very big and very cold and very hot, we should also have a group on things that are very complex. But then the dean is a historian of science, of arts, sorry, he's a historian of arts, and the challenge then would be to explain to him what that meant. So I told him, look, history is the business of understanding events and the relation between events as a function of time. And well, that by itself is a complex network. And one of the first things that we learn in this field of complex systems and networks is that you can't always, not even in principle, tell the causes apart from the consequences. And that's very helpful to understand history, not only in arts, but other areas. And that helps you explain, for example, some international conflicts and so on. But time itself cannot be defined without complexity, because the reason why we remember the past and we cannot remember the future, that the symmetry is defined by the arrow of time through something that we all use in physics, but is especially well conceived in the context of complex systems called entropy. Very well. So I think that worked. So a center has been created. It is the Center for Network Dynamics. It's placed in the Department of Physics. And it's thanks to this initiative that we can have people like Arthur here. Despite his last name, Arthur is not Italian. He was actually born and raised in Brazil. He comes from the land of the cheese bread, not cheesecake, cheese bread. You can buy on Whole Foods. Is the biggest insular state in Brazil, no borders with other countries, no borders with the sea, which is a source of many jokes given the coastline of Brazil. They don't have a beach. And so when he considered to come here, I said, we are on the North Shore. He was excited immediately. I said, but it's not the sea, it's a lake. He said, oh, I take that. And so he came here first as a visiting student. Then he spent some time in Luxembourg, and he has been back now as a postdoc. And he is a very active researcher in this area. Now, I have to say, Arthur is a converted physicist. He's not, he is an electrical engineer by training. And here I have to say that is very useful for us because he doesn't take for granted things that we are used with. The main thing he researches in physics, we always start the project by saying, given the initial conditions, blah, blah, blah. Well, he studies the initial conditions. His main research is on determining what that initial condition is and the fundamental limits on determining that condition. So he studies what we call the observability of complex systems. And I cannot say that Arthur was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, but he was born with a multimeter in his hand. His dad was an electrical engineer. His mom was an electrical engineer. And I see his wife right there. Guess what? She's also an electrical engineer.
What a surprise.
Yeah. So, well, this brings me then to the lectures. These lectures were, we are very thankful to Paul for creating these lectures through a gift. It's in honor of his late wife. And this is not just one more lecture series. This is an important one because it is for early career researchers, students and postdocs. Arthur is a postdoc, right at the time when they are the main drivers of research. So they are able to talk about things that they are working on, and that at a time when they are creating new ideas and projecting things that they can do in the future. It's not just one lecture, it's a series of 8 lectures. And I think the goal of today is to show why you should show up for the next 7 lectures. So I think I have more things I can always say, but I think that this is pretty much the context. Andre, would you like to add anything? No. Okay, so then having said all of that, Arthur, you have the floor.
I thought we had agreed that you would only tell the audience that I'm an engineer by the end of the,
I forgot
the lecture.
So
that's okay. How is the audio in the back? Everyone listening to me all right? Okay, cool. So, well, I'll welcome you all to the 2024 Annual Sievert Prize Lecture Series. Today, the first lecture is in network theory. So let's start with the most basic question, which is, what is a network? And well, what I want to show you is that whether you realize this or not, most systems can be actually represented by networks. So we can start perhaps with the most well-known in society right now, the social networks, which we can represent by people, you, for example, and the interactions between you and your friends, and the interactions between the friends of your friends, and so on. And then we represent this by a network by representing each person as its own node and the interactions between these people through links. This network can happen in a physical space. It may be the interactions between you and your neighbors, but it may also be in the digital media like Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and so on. And we can go beyond this kind of digital media and also look at the internet itself as a network. And in this case, the nodes are going to represent servers, users, internet providers. And the interactions between those servers are going to be responsible for the transmission of data and exchange of data between those users. Well, you can already see that this may become very complicated by the large scale of this network. But we can also go to networks in infrastructure systems, in this case, the traffic roads. And this is exactly what the GPS would show you. And it would compute what is the best path that you can take from your place to perhaps this lecture series. We can look at other infrastructure systems like the power grids. And in this case, the network is responsible for transmitting energy all the way from generators to the consumers. We could go to networks inside you, like in biology, perhaps the most complex systems are our brain. And in this case, the network can have different representations and scales. We could be looking at the networks on how the different brain regions interact with each other, which in this case would be in a more macro scale. But we could also go to the micro scale and look how those neurons communicate with each other, how the electrical signal is transmitted from one neuron to the other, and what is the network underlying this. And we could go to many more kinds of networks. We could be talking about water transmission networks, or perhaps the air transportation network between airports. We could be looking at networks inside your body, like the gene regulatory network that is responsible for cellular processes inside you. We could also look at the network of interactions between proteins. We could go outside the body and look at networks on how birds interact with other birds and how they form flocks, and networks between species, for example. And finally, networks that are responsible for intelligence. In this case, I'm showing here a network responsible actually for artificial intelligence, represented by a typical neural network, and it's responsible for processing and predicting data in technology. So finally, we come back to the question of what is a network. And then we summarize that a network is a representation of a system that can be encompassed by nodes representing agents, components, and so on, and links determining the interactions between those nodes. Well, the next very question is, how do we study these networks? And perhaps the one fundamental approach to that would be the reductionistic approach. And if we look at the definition of reductionism, we say that reductionism is the idea that you can understand things by taking them apart into smaller components. So we can have a network like this one with very different nodes, as I represent by different colors. We can have different kinds of edges, like, for example, node blue here talks with node red, and node red talks back to node blue. But for example, this gray node talks with the blue node, but not the other way around. And the idea of reductionism is that we can break apart this network, isolate individual component here, and look of what goes inside it, try to come up with mathematical equations to describe its behavior or its properties. And then once we finally figure out what is going on inside this node, we put it back in the network and we analyze this whole system as the sum of the parts. And this is an important assumption in the reductionism approach, is that the network is the sum of the parts, meaning that if you understand just one node or every other node, you're going to understand the behavior of the entire system by just putting it together and maybe doing some superposition or addition of its process. But let's look at one example of where reductionism as a theory works. And in this case, we look at linear circuits theory coming all the way back to high school physics. And we have a simple circuit like this one, represented by 2 sources and 3 resistors. And the question is, what is the current flowing from point A to B? Well, reductionism, because of the reductionism, we can break this problem down into 2 equivalent problems and smaller problems, where in this case here, we first take only the first source and we isolate the second source by short circuiting. And then, given the simplicity of this circuit, we can solve it just by looking at the voltage time equals resistance time current. We can do the same for the second circuit, which is an equivalent approach. The only difference is that now we're looking at the source 2 and isolating the source 1. And then we can solve the current flowing through this branch in this first problem and in the second problem as well. And then because of the principle of superposition of waves, which apply both for direct current circuits as well as alternate current circuits, we can just sum the solution of those two smaller problems, and then we get the solution of this bigger problem. Well, that's one case where reductionism works as a theory, but it's also a framework or a paradigm. So we could look, for example, of its applications in other fields. Let's consider neuroscience, for example. So it's the idea that we can understand or perhaps start understanding the brain by just looking at one individual component of the brain, the neuron. And a classical experiment is the measurement of the electrical signal that flows through this neuron, given by this time series data here that it's measured. And the contribution of Hodgkin-Huxley in their model, which guided them to the Nobel Prize award from their work in 1952, is the development of a mathematical model here representing their neuron model that is capable of representing the dynamics of this data here. In that case, this model is is based on representing the actual potential of this neuron, the flux of calcium and sodium through ion channels. And at the end of the day, he has a model that is reproduces the data with its actual potential spiking here, as in a neuron, but as well as being capable of predicting this data. Well, the reductionism worked here, but it also works in other fields of biology. We could consider, for example, the understanding of cellular process through molecular biology, and start understanding what are the functions of a cell by looking at what a protein does, for example, just looking at one isolated component. Well, in this case, we can do some exotic simulations representing the protein by a sequence of amino acids. Those amino acids, depending on how they arrange it with each other, they have interacting bonds between them, and this will determine how they fold. And depending on the geometry of those proteins, they may be responsible for the different kinds of functions, may be responsible for transporting molecules from one side of the cell to the other, as well as may be responsible for some kind of locking mechanism that captures molecules to inside the cell. Well, I'm an engineer, so let's introduce an example from engineering. And one classical one is power grids, which also tells that I am an electrical engineer. So in this case, we can look at power grid by focusing our study first on the dynamics of a generator. And in this case, we have a very classical generator, fossil fuel based. So we have some kind of heat being generated over here, which is responsible for this heavy machinery to rotate. And then due to that electrical coupling, we have some electrical power being fed to the power grid network. We can represent this by very fundamental equations that comes from Newton's second law. In this case, we can represent this by looking at this equation that determines what is the angular acceleration of the generator. And we represent the state of the generator by looking at the angle of this generator, because this generator is a rotating machine, and we can look at how it rotates with a given specified frequency or so on, and how it accelerates or breaks due to changes in the system. It's going to be a function of the inertia, which is responsible for how heavy this, which represents how heavy this machinery is. And it's going to depend on the difference between the mechanical power and the electrical power. But this is not very different from what we could get from a representation of the dynamics of a pendulum. After all, the pendulum is also represented only by its angle. But at the end of the day, the reductionistic approach to the power grids looks at the contribution of this generator to the power injected into the power grid by lumping all the network into one single term here under very idealistic assumptions. So we assume that the power grid has constant voltage, it has constant frequency, which may not happen in reality, especially under some catastrophic events or something like that. So this gives us just one term to analyze how the interaction between the generator and the whole network happens. And that may be just too simple. So if you were to believe 100% in this reductionistic approach, then you would believe that everything in biology can be explained by its chemistry, which in turn can be explained by atomic physics, which in turn can be explained by its elementary particles. And then if you go from this top-bottom approach, then you could also go bottom-up and then say that you can understand the individual by itself and therefore understand its role in the society and how laws and regulations are invented and so on. But we know that this is an oversimplification and that doesn't happen. And the reason is because of another phenomena. One that's going to tell us that most networks are actually more than the sum of the parts and that we cannot approach these kind of problems through a reductionistic view. So does this mean that we should say goodbye to reductionism? Well, this is a famous quote by Albert Laszlo Barabasi. And in this quote, he says that reductionism as a paradigm is expired and complexity as a field is tired. Data-based mathematical models of complex systems are offering a fresh perspective, rapidly developing into a new discipline, network science. And then he calls his paper the network takeover, meaning that precisely because of the existence of networks, the reductionist approach is not anymore sufficient for this. Indeed, by saying that reductionism is obsolete and not useful anymore may be too strong of a statement. So he immediately append this statement in his paper, saying that the real worry is not with reductionism, which as a paradigm and tool is rather useful for us to understand components. It is necessary, but no longer sufficient when you want to study the entire system, the entire network. So let's look back at our circuit example so that we can understand why reductionism may fail and what is needed for us to understand new systems. So the reductionism works here in this classic case of linear circuits because those circuits are represented by passive components. Those are resistors, inductors, capacitors, and so on. And all they are responsible for is for storing energy and releasing energy. And yes, they are useful. That's where the basics from turning on and off lights come from, how we, the traditional refrigerators and dryers work. But as we advanced as a society, we came up with new kinds of components, and those are the active components. Active components are, for example, a diode, which is present in radios, TVs, and they are responsible for saturation effects in the circuits. This introduces nonlinearities. And because of those saturation effects, now what we have as a wave function here may be, once you introduce a diode, now we may have pulse-like waves. And this nonlinear affection breaks this assumption of the principle of superposition, which leads to new questions. Other kinds of active components would be the transistors. We can say those, we could see the nonlinear relation between voltage and current in a transistor right here. And these transistors are responsible for logic gates, responsible for integrated circuits, the digital processing that happens inside any kind of smartphone in your pocket. And we could go even more fancy and look at Josephson junctions, where we have a very nonlinear relationship between voltage and current here by looking at this curve here and seeing that we can even have current flowing through this component with zero voltage. We're going to talk more about the Josephson functions in lecture number 2 and its role in emergence. But yeah, once you have nonlinearity, and interactions between systems, between nodes, then components, then you can have this effect of emergence. And emergence occurs when a complex system exhibits behaviors that cannot be anticipated from the properties of the parts. They become more than the sum of the parts. And therefore, isolating those nodes is not enough anymore for you to understand how they work together, because this behavior only happens when they interact together. And if we go back to those examples of where the reductionism was being applied successfully, we can see examples of emergent behavior that needs the study of integrated components in order for us to understand the whole. So we can go back to an example of emergence in natural systems like the brain. And now we know that a single neuron cannot explain how cognitive functions happen inside our brain, how brain diseases emerge, how we process memory, and so on. Therefore, we have to understand the interactions between those two neurons in order for us to start having a grasp of those functions. We could go also for the example in cell biology, and we can see that one single protein is not responsible for for fundamental process in cells. They are not responsible for cell division. One single protein is not responsible for cell division, cell death, and so on. And that happens because of this complex, elaborate network of interactions between genes and their products, in this case of the proteins, and you can look here at apoptosis or cell death, and look here how many genes are influencing and leading to this process, as well as to cell proliferation and as well as to cancer. Because cancer is not a product of just one protein, it's a product of multiple proteins and multiple genes interacting together. And that's exactly what makes it so hard to intervene on. And we could even talk about life and the role of those gene circuitry in it, but let's not go that far right now. Well, so far I've been talking about emergence, and in the case of molecular biology, for example, this emergence might come from the interaction between two different proteins and so on. But emergence may also come from the interaction between the same components, and with the only difference being the network of interactions behind them. So we can take the example of a graphite and diamond. And the only those are all materials that are made of carbon. The only difference between them is the network of interactions between those atoms. In this case, we have a graphite represented by networks that are layered with very weak coupling between two layers, making it soft, whereas diamond has a fully very strongly connected network, making it hard and also more rare in nature. We go back to emergence in engineering systems, for example, and we can see that, well, in this case, engineering systems are built by the humans. Therefore, we should expect to understand them 100%, right? But that's not really the case. It's precisely because of these strong interactions between consumers, generators, the different types of generators, that not new kind of phenomena, that undesired phenomena may happen in those engineering systems. And this phenomena may be, for example, the existence of cascades being propagated in the system. Here we have an example of a blackout that happened in North America in 2003, left most of dispersion here without any kind of energy supply. And if you want to understand this cascade failure or how it spreads in the network, then you have to look at the network contribution and the interaction between generators and its network. Now, it's not anymore enough for you to lump all the contribution of the network to just one single term, but you have to look at how this generator interacts with its neighbors or the neighbors of its neighbors. Then you have to expand these equations, the swing equation,
to now represent more complex interactions between the generators and the consumers and so on. Now we look at the how generator 1 interacts with its perhaps generator 2 and 3 in its neighborhood, and any influence coming from generator 4 affects 1 indirectly through 2. So, or through 3, for example. Of course, this network is much more complicated than just those 4 nodes here. We have a whole power grid system and a lot of data to integrate in it. And if you understand this kind of interaction between generators and the network, that you can understand processes like synchronization between those generators, as well as how they lose synchronization and how you may try to develop new kind of control methods to enforce the synchronization and the desired behavior of the power grid. Well, we could go also to other examples where reductionism fails, and we could look at epidemics. And I know that everyone started off epidemics precisely because of COVID, so I'll guarantee that I'm not giving any COVID examples here in this presentation. But this is a very interesting problem, because so far reductionism was all about taking a full network and breaking it down into pieces. But in epidemics, this is an example where you take this whole network and you lump it down into a whole, where instead of looking at the individuals and interactions between the individuals, you just mix them together in some ball here and assume that the network of interactions between them is not really that important. And that will lead you to this kind of models that allow you to represent the populations of susceptible individuals and infected individuals, and how they infect each other through the transmission rate, or how they get recovered, and so on. And this allows you to come up with just one single quantity that allows you to quantify whether this epidemic is gonna die out. In this case, if this R quantity is gonna be smaller than 1, or whether it's gonna reach some endemic state and persist in the population, like in this plot here, where the number of infected population saturates to a non-zero value. Well, you may think that this kind of approach is sufficient to describe epidemics, but in the 1970s, with the gonorrhea epidemic, we have a very sharp epidemic peak that happened here that was not capable of being described by this kind of reductionistic approach. In this case, since gonorrhea it's a sexually transmitted disease, one might expect that the average contact between one individual and others is smaller than 1, and therefore this R here, this R quantity, the epidemic threshold, it would also be smaller than 1. That would be the prediction of the theory. And since R is smaller than 1, this epidemic would die out, but that's precisely not what we see in the data. There was an epidemic peak in the 70s. So how do we explain this? And this leads to new models that are capable of describing this. So we have to departure from this reductionism approach once more. And by doing that, it allows us to see that actually when you look at the gonorrhea as a case example, it was not the mixed population that was responsible for the spreading of this disease, but rather a small subset of this population that was responsible for, where 2% of these individuals were responsible for 60% of all infections. And therefore, we needed to create a model that isolate this population from this population and look at interactions between those two populations to understand this. In this case, those 2% of individuals were actually the sex workers. And this changed the whole strategy on how to mitigate the epidemic. It changes who you should target with vaccination in order to solve this problem.
You could go beyond those examples of only two populations and epidemic spreading between them, and could also look at epidemic spreading over networks. And in this case, it's just that the equation gets incremented by including the effects of the transmissions between, for example, one population in one city of Ireland and another population in another city of Ireland. And we can model this outflux and influx of infected people by looking at the data coming from the transportation networks between those two cities. So with this, we arrive at a theory that seeks to explain almost everything. And we say almost everything because, yes, the reductionism approach is still important for us to understand the components. But this theory emphasizes that most components actually belong to a larger system, and those systems can be explained by networks. And because those networks belong to different fields like physics, biology, engineering, or we may be looking at the mathematics describing those systems like differential equations, or even at computer science with the invention of artificial intelligence and so on, there is a need for a theory that underlies all those fields. And if you ask me what is the driving force behind this theory, what motivates it to move forward in the present, that would be data. And the availability of data throughout all those fields that have been coming in the last decades. Data that comes in many forms. If we look at culture and social networks, it comes in the form of tweets. Those tweets now allow us to understand what is the election and voting dynamics in the country. It allows us to understand how organized crime arises through those networks. We can look at data coming from biological data from biology to understand gene expression data, try to understand cancer, other kinds of complex diseases, but also data come from finance to understand financial crisis and everything else. And indeed, it's not enough to have data, we also have to have a very strong theory to explain all this data. And indeed, the problem of network theory comes as a theory much before we had all this availability of data. We could give it, we could attribute its start to other problems, but perhaps the canonical answer to this would be Euler and the 7 bridges problem of Königsberg, coming all the way back from 1736. And in this case, this problem came in the form of a question. Can we find a wall? So this is the city of Königsberg. And as you can see, its land masses are connected by different bridges. And the question is, can we find a wall that crosses each bridge once and only once? And well, the contribution of Euler to this problem was precisely the abstraction of not looking at this as a city, but rather as land masses being connections, being connected by those bridges, and therefore arriving at the first graph or network representation of a problem. And then, if you were to examine this graph and you could try to find a walk going through the city, perhaps with one iteration like from this node to this node, then this node, then this node, this node, this node, and this node, you would have this walk, but you would notice that, for example, this link here or this bridge was not passed by through, during this walk, and that actually the answer of this question is that there exists no solution for the city. And the contribution of Euler was much more than just realizing that there was no solution for the city. He actually formalized the problem in a much more abstract and general way. He proved the solution for any network, and he showed that there is going to exist a walk for any network if and only if the number of nodes with an odd number of edges is exactly 0 or 2. And if we look at this network example here, we're going to see that the number of edges connected to a node is, for example, for node 3, we have 3 edges, so it's 3. The number of edges here is also 3, it's 5. and it's 3. Therefore, all nodes have an odd number of connections, and this doesn't satisfy the condition for his theorem. Well, his theorem is only going to be satisfied if the number of nodes with odd number of edges is exactly 0 or 2. Two examples of that would be a cycle where all of them have an even number of connections, or a chain graph where only the extremes have an odd number of connections. And with this, we arrive at the question of what is network theory and what this lecture series is going to be about. Network theory is the study of network representations of physical, biological, and social phenomena, leading to predictive models of these phenomena. And this is going to be what these lecture series are going to be about. Our goal here is to give a non-mathematical introduction to this theory of networks and illustrate its many applications and its development, its recent developments, as well as its path forward. We could recommend this book by Newman, almost 800 pages long book, very dense with the mathematics of network, which even despite its length, it's called only an introduction to the networks. Well, with this, I reached the end of this lecture. I'd like to emphasize that today we cover an introduction or a motivation of this network theory, but we're going to be going through many of the problems that makes this network theory needed and useful. We're going to go through emergence and other cascades and other types of systems. One thing that I want to motivate with this slide here is that we're coming up with different kinds of case studies to show that this network theory is interdisciplinary and it's applicable to very different kinds of systems, maybe superconducting devices, financial crisis, or quantum networks. And that's what we're going to be emphasizing in each one of those lectures. Finally, I would like to acknowledge everyone that made this lecture series possible. In special thanks to Paul Sievert for funding those lecture series throughout those years and making it a tradition in the department. Special thanks to André, the chair of our department, for organizing this, and as well as for the Center for Network Dynamics, where I have the chance to collaborate with all these wonderful people.